Deep in the towering embrace of Redwood National Park, a struggling single dad pulls a lost hiker from an icy creek, only to discover she's a secret billionaire fleeing her fate. How does one act of kindness unravel their lives and weave them together? What mysteries lie hidden among the ancient trees, waiting to be uncovered? Step into this inspiring love story where miracles bloom from the heart. If you enjoy heartfelt journeys like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss a single chapter. Now let's dive in with Redwood Redemption. A struggling single dad helped rescue a lost hiker only to learn she was a secret billionaire. The sky above Redwood National Park was still bruised with the gray of pre-dawn when Daniel Carter stepped out of his cabin, his boots sinking into the damp earth. At 49, Dan moved with the deliberate gait of a man who'd carried more than his share of burdens, broad shoulders hunched slightly, as if shielding something fragile within. The air smelled of pine and wet moss, a scent that had once filled him with wonder, but now just reminded him of routines. His Nikon camera, an old friend from brighter days, hung around his neck, its lens cap firmly in place. He hadn't taken a real photograph in years, not since Sarah died. The forest was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a hawk. Dan adjusted his ranger cap, the faded green fabric a badge of his current life, a tour guide in a place he'd once dreamed of immortalizing through his lens. Back at the cabin, his kids, Emma, 8, and Lucas, 6, were still asleep, their small bodies curled under quilts Sarah had sewn. The thought of them tightened his chest. He'd kept them fed, clothed, and safe these past 3 years, but the stack of bills on the kitchen counter whispered failure louder every day. He was halfway down the trail to Hyperion, the tallest, redwood in the park, a towering giant at 379 feet, when he heard it, a faint cry, sharp and human, cutting through the stillness. Dan froze, his breath catching. It wasn't a bird or the wind. He scanned the undergrowth, his heart thudding against his ribs. The sound came again, weaker this time, from the direction of the ravine below the trail. "Hold on," he called, his voice rough from disuse. He scrambled down the slope, pine needles sticking to his palms, until he saw her, a woman, sprawled near the creek, her clothes soaked and clinging to her frame. She was older than he'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with dark hair streaked with silver plastered to her face. Her right ankle was twisted at an odd angle, and a broken camera lay beside her in the mud. "Hey, you okay?" Dan knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly. She looked up, her hazel eyes wide with pain, but steady, like she was sizing him up even now. I slipped," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Trying to get a shot of Hyperion. Stupid, I know." Dan glanced at the tree looming above them, its branches disappearing into the mist. "Not stupid," he said gruffly. "Just bad timing. Can you stand?" She tried, wincing as her ankle buckled. Dan caught her arm, steadying her. She was lighter than he'd expected, fragile almost, but there was a spark in her that made him pause. "I've got you," he said, and before she could protest, he hoisted her up, one arm under, her knees, the other around her back. She stiffened, then relaxed, her hand clutching his jacket. "I'm Claire," she said as he started up the slope, her breath warm against his neck. "Dan," he replied, focusing on the uneven ground. "You're lucky I was out here. Not many. Come this early." "Lucky," she echoed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Guess I owe you one." He grunted, unwilling to admit how her words stirred something in him, gratitude maybe, or just the novelty of being needed beyond his kids. The hike back to his cabin took 20 minutes, his boots sinking deeper with each step, Claire's weight a quiet reminder of the world beyond his solitude. She didn't talk much, just shivered against him, and he found himself wondering who she was, this woman chasing giants in the dawn. Inside the cabin, he set her on the threadbare couch near the wood stove, its embers still glowing from last. And night. The place was a mess, dishes in the sink, Emma's drawings scattered on the table, but it was warm, lived in. Claire's gaze swept the room, landing on a framed photo above the mantel, a younger Dan, Sarah, and baby Emma laughing. Under a redwood canopy, he saw the question in her eyes, but didn't offer an answer. "Stay put," he said instead, grabbing a blanket from the armchair. He draped it over her shoulders, then knelt to check her ankle. It was swollen, bruising already, but not broken. "You'll live. Just need to rest it," she nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. "Thank you, Dan, really." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the sincerity in her voice. Part of the job. But it wasn't. Not really. He could have called for help, left her with the Rangers. Instead, he'd brought her here into his space, and he wasn't sure why. Footsteps pattered down the hall, and Emma poked her head out, her blonde curls wild from sleep. "Daddy! Who's that?" Lucas followed, rubbing his eyes. His dinosaur. Pajamas wrinkled. "Is she lost?" Claire smiled, softer this time, and Dan felt a pang. Sarah used to smile like that. "Just a little," Claire said. "Your dad's my hero today." Emma giggled and Lucas edged closer, curious. Dan stood, brushing off his knees. "Go get dressed, you two. School soon." They scampered off, leaving him alone with Claire again. She tilted her head, studying him. "You're good with them." "They're all I've got," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He turned to stoke the fire, hiding the flush creeping up his neck. What was it about her that made him talk? Claire shifted, wincing slightly. "I came here to remember something," she said, almost to herself. "Didn't expect to need rescuing." Dan paused, poker in hand, the flames crackling between them. "Remember what?" She didn't answer, just stared into the fire, her expression distant. He let it drop, sensing a wall he couldn't climb. Not yet, but as he watched her, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd handed her, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years. Purpose, maybe, or curiosity. Either way, it scared him. Outside, the forest woke slowly, light filtering through the redwoods. Inside, Dan busied himself with breakfast, stealing glances at Claire. She was a stranger, sure, but she'd landed in his life like a stone in still water, ripples spreading where he'd thought none could reach. And as Emma and Lucas bounded back in, chattering about their new guest, Dan wondered what else she'd stir up before she left. The wood stove popped and hissed as Dan tossed another log into its belly, the heat spreading through the cabin like a slow exhale. Claire sat on the couch, the blanket tucked around her shoulders, her damp hair drying into loose waves. She looked smaller now, less like the determined woman he'd pulled from the creek, and more like someone who'd wandered too far from home. Dan caught himself staring and turned back to the stove, jabbing at the embers with more force than necessary. "You don't have to babysit me," Claire said, her voice cutting through the quiet. There was a dry edge to it, a hint of humor that made Dan glance over his shoulder. She was watching him, her hazel eyes sharp despite the exhaustion, lining her face. "Not babysitting," he said, setting the poker aside. "Just making sure you don't keel over on my couch. Bad for business." She laughed, a short surprise sound that bounced off the cabin walls. It was the first real laugh he'd heard in months, maybe years, and it tugged at something rusty in his chest. "Fair enough," she said. "I'm not exactly wilderness material, am I?" Dan shrugged, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You made it to Hyperion. Takes guts, sprained ankle or not." He didn't say it to flatter her, just stating a fact, but the way her smile softened told him it landed deeper than he'd meant. The patter of small feet interrupted them as Emma and Lucas barreled back into the room, dressed now but still, buzzing with curiosity. Emma clutched a crayon drawing of a tree, thrusting it toward Claire. "This is for you," she said, her blue eyes wide. "It's a redwood, like the one you saw." Claire took the paper, her fingers brushing Emma's, and Dan saw her expression shift, something tender flickering there, like a memory breaking loose. "It's beautiful," she said. "You've got an artist's eye." Emma beamed, and Lucas piped up, "I helped, I did the roots." He pointed to a scribble of brown at the bottom, his grin gap-toothed and proud. "Roots are the best part," Claire said, winking at him. "They keep the whole thing standing." Dan watched. The exchange, a knot loosening in his gut. The kids hadn't warmed to anyone this fast since Sarah, not even their teachers or the well-meaning neighbors who dropped off casseroles after the funeral. He busied himself at the stove again, cracking eggs into a skillet, the sizzle filling the awkward space where his thoughts churned. Who was this woman, slipping into their lives like she belonged? "Coffee's still hot if you want more," he said, nodding toward the mug on the table beside her. She'd barely touched the first one he'd given her, but he needed something to say. Silence felt too heavy with her here. "Thanks." Claire reached for it, her movements slow, deliberate. "You're a good host, Dan, better than I deserve, showing up like this." He grunted, flipping the eggs. "Not like I had a choice, couldn't leave you out there." But that wasn't the whole truth. He could have called Tom, the ranger on duty, or hauled her to the park office. Instead, he'd brought her home, and he still wasn't sure why. Breakfast was simple, eggs, toast, a few strips of bacon, but the kids attacked it like it was a feast, chattering about school and the owl they'd heard last night. Claire listened, nodding at the right moments, her presence a quiet anchor amid their chaos. Danate standing at the counter keeping one eye on the clock. The school bus would be here soon, and he had a tour group at 9. Routine kept him sane. "You're welcome to stay till your ankle's better," he said abruptly, setting his plate in the sink. "Couch isn't much, but it's yours if you need it." Claire looked up, surprised. "I don't want to impose. You've already done enough." "You're not imposing," he said, sharper than he meant. "It's a sprain, not a broken leg. Couple days, you'll be fine unless you've got somewhere else to be." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the mug in her hands. "No, nowhere else right now." The words hung there, fragile and loaded, and Dan felt a prickle of curiosity he couldn't shake. "All right then." He turned to the kids. "Bus time. Grab your stuff." They scampered off, leaving him alone with Claire again. He crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "You got a phone? Someone looking for you?" She shook her head too quick. "Not really. I'm taking a break." "From everything?" He raised an eyebrow but didn't push. People came to Redwood for all kinds of reasons, some to find themselves, some to lose themselves. He'd seen it all in his years here. Still, there was something about her, those steady eyes that guarded. Tone, that didn't fit the usual lost soul story. The kids burst back in, backpacks slung over their shoulders. Emma hugged Dan's legs, and Lucas waved at Claire. "Bye, lady! Don't fall again!" "Lucas," Dan warned, but Claire laughed again, brighter this time. "I'll try not to," she called as they raced out the door. Dan followed, herding them to the dirt road where the yellow bus rumbled into view. He waved until it disappeared around the bend, then trudged back inside, the morning chill clinging to his jacket. Claire was still on the couch, her good leg tucked under her, the blanket pooled around her waist. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, a log splitting with a sharp pop. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said finally, breaking the silence. "But if you're in trouble, I'd rather know now than later." She blinked, then smiled, a small, crooked thing that didn't reach her eyes. "No trouble, just me, trying to figure some things out." He nodded, accepting that for now. "Fair enough. I've got a tour soon. You'll be okay here?" "I'll manage," she said. "Might even clean up your kitchen as a thank you." "Don't you dare," he shot back, half serious. "That's my mess." Her laugh followed, him as he grabbed his gear and headed out, the sound lingering like an echo in the trees. The tour group was waiting at the trailhead, 6 retirees with cameras and questions, and Dan slipped into his role, pointing out ferns and owl nests, his voice steady but distant. His mind kept drifting back to the cabin, to Claire's quiet presence, her unexplained arrival. By the time he returned, the sun was high, casting dappled light through the redwoods. He stepped inside, expecting to find her napping or gone. Instead, she was at the table flipping through an old photo album he hadn't touched in years, shots of the forest, Sarah laughing, him younger and unburdened. Her fingers traced a picture of Hyperion at sunrise, its trunk glowing gold. "Didn't peg you for a snoop," he said, but there was no heat in it. She looked up, unapologetic. "These are incredible, Dan. You've got a gift." "Had," he corrected, setting his hat on the rack. "Past tense." She closed the album, her expression thoughtful. "Doesn't look past to me, just waiting." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. The afternoon stretched ahead, unfamiliar with her here, and Dan felt the weight of it, the pull of routine clashing with something new, something alive. Claire shifted, wincing as she adjusted her ankle, and he moved to help without thinking, steadying her arm. "Careful," he said. "You're stuck with me till that heals." "Could be worse," she replied, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in a long while Dan thought maybe she was right. The next morning dawned crisp and golden, the kind of February day in Northern California that made you forget winter ever existed. Dan stood at the cabin's small porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, the steam curling into the air. The redwoods stretched skyward beyond the clearing, their shadows long and jagged across the earth. He'd slept fitfully, aware of Claire on the couch just beyond his bedroom door, her soft breathing a quiet intrusion into the life he'd carved. Out for himself and the kids. Inside, Emma and Lucas were already orbiting her like moths to a flame. He could hear their voices, Emma's high and eager, Lucas's a tumbling rush, as they bombarded her with questions. "Do you live in a city? Have you seen a bear? Can you draw like Daddy used to?" Dan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Kids had a way of cutting through the noise, didn't they? He stepped back inside, the screen door creaking shut behind him. Claire sat at the table now, her ankle propped on a stool, a pencil in hand as she sketched something on a napkin for Lucas. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band Emma must have lent her, and she looked settled, like she'd been here longer than a day. "Morning," Dan said, setting his mug on the counter. "They wearing you out yet?" Claire glanced up, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Not a chance. They're better company than most adults I know." "Low bar," he replied, and she laughed, that same short, bright sound that caught him off guard yesterday. He busied himself with breakfast, pulling a loaf of bread from the pantry. Toast again. He'd meant to grocery shop, but time slipped. Away lately, like sand through clenched fists. "Daddy, can we take Claire to see the big tree today?" Emma asked, bouncing on her toes. She said she didn't get a good picture before she fell. Dan paused, butter knife hovering over the bread. "Her ankle's still messed up, kiddo. Maybe tomorrow." "I can manage," Claire cut in, her tone firm but gentle. "If you've got time, I'd love to try again, with your camera maybe. Mine's toast." He met her gaze, surprised by the request. The Nikon around his neck felt heavier suddenly, a ghost of the man he'd been. "It's been a while," he said, deflecting. "Lens is probably dusty." "All the more reason," she said, undeterred. "You can't let talent like yours sit on a shelf, Dan." He grunted, turning back to the stove. Talent, that word stung, a reminder of dreams he'd buried with Sarah. But the kids were watching him now, hopeful, and Claire's quiet challenge hung in the air. "Fine," he said finally. "After breakfast, but you're not walking far." The cheer from Emma and Lucas drowned out any chance of retreat. An hour later, they were on the trail to Hyperion, Dan leading the way with Claire leaning on a makeshift crutch he'd fashioned from a fallen branch. The kids darted ahead, chasing each other through the ferns, their laughter echoing off the trees. Claire moved slower, her jaw tight with effort, but she didn't complain. "You don't have to prove anything," Dan said, falling into step beside her. "We can turn back." "I'm not proving," she replied, her breath uneven. "I just need to see it again, up close." He nodded, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. They reached the base of Hyperion 15 minutes later, its trunk a cathedral of bark rising into the mist. The kids craned their necks, awestruck as always, and Dan felt that old pull, the urge to frame it, to capture the way light danced through the branches. He glanced at Claire, who'd sunk onto a mossy log, her eyes fixed on the tree. "Why this one?" he asked, unclipping the Nikon from his neck. "Plenty of redwoods out here." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the crutches. "Rough wood. My dad brought me here when I was 16. He was a botanist, loved these giants more than anything. We stood right here, and he told me they'd outlive us all. Said it was comforting, knowing something could last." Dan lowered the camera, her words sinking in. "He's still around?" "No," she said softly. "Died 10 years ago. Cancer. I haven't been back since. Until now." The air shifted between them, heavy with shared loss. Dan thought of Sarah, her smile fading in that hospital bed, and swallowed hard. "I get it," he said. "Lost my wife 3 years back. Car accident. These trees, they've seen me through some dark days." Claire looked at him, really, looked, and he saw his own grief mirrored in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, "about her." "Yeah, me too, about your dad." He lifted the camera, focusing on Hyperion's base, the shutter clicking before he could second-guess it. The sound jolted him, familiar, alive, and he kept going, adjusting the lens, chasing the light. Claire watched, silent, a small smile playing on her lips. When he lowered the camera, she nodded toward it. "Show me?" He hesitated, then handed it over. She scrolled through the shots, 3 quick frames, nothing fancy, but her expression lit up. "These are stunning, Dan. You've still got it." "Luck," he muttered, but her praise warmed him. A flicker of pride he hadn't felt in too long. The kids ran back, tugging at his sleeves, and he let them drag him into their game of tag, Claire laughing from her perch. For a moment, the forest felt lighter, the shadows less daunting. That night, back at the cabin, Claire sat by the fire while Dan tucked the kids in. She'd insisted on helping with dinner, boxed mac and cheese, nothing gourmet. But her ease with Emma and Lucas had turned it into a small celebration. Now, with the kids asleep, the quiet settled in, thicker than before. "You're good out." "There," Claire said, breaking it. "Not just the photos, the way you know this place." "Been here my whole life," he replied, poking at the fire. "Grew up 2 miles down the road. Redwoods in my blood, I guess." She tilted her head, studying him. "Ever think of leaving?" "Once. With Sarah. We talked about Oregon, maybe Portland. Didn't happen." He shrugged, the memory a dull ache. "You, where's home?" "San Francisco," she said, then added, "Sort of. I travel a lot. Work." "What do you do?" he asked, casual but curious. She paused, her fingers tightening around the mug in her hands. "I manage things, projects, nothing exciting." It was vague, too vague, and Dan's instincts prickled. Before he could press, his phone buzzed. On the table, a rare signal out here. It was Tom, the ranger from the park office. "Hey, Dan," Tom's voice crackled through. "Got some fancy folks asking around today. Looking for a woman, mid-40s, dark hair. Said she might have gotten lost. You seen anyone like that?" Dan's eyes flicked to Claire. She was staring into the fire, but her shoulders tensed like she'd heard every word. "Not sure," he said into the phone. "Lots of hikers out here. She okay?" "Dunno," Tom replied. "They seemed antsy. Just thought I'd check." "Thanks, Tom. I'll let you know." He hung up the silent, stretching taut. Claire didn't look at him, but he could feel her bracing. "Someone looking for you?" he asked, keeping his tone even. She exhaled, a small, shaky sound. Maybe. I told you, I'm taking a break. Didn't expect anyone to notice. He crossed his arms, leaning back. They sounded worried. You in some kind of mess? No mess, she said, meeting his gaze at last. Just people who don't like it when I disappear. He didn't buy it, not fully, but her eyes held a plea he couldn't ignore. All right, he said, your business. Just don't bring trouble to my door. I won't, she promised, and he wanted to believe her. The fire snapped, casting shadows across her face, and Dan felt the weight of her secret settling in beside his own. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't his fight. Not yet, but as he banked the coals for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd already changed everything. The third morning broke with a quiet Dan hadn't felt in years. Not the heavy silence of grief, but something softer, like the forest holding its breath. He stood at the kitchen counter, watching the coffee drip into the pot, the rhythm steady, against the chaos of his thoughts. Claire had been here 2 nights now, her presence weaving into the cabin's routines like a thread he hadn't known was missing. The kids adored her, and he wasn't sure what he felt. Not yet. She was still asleep on the couch when he checked, her blanket tangled around her legs, one arm flung over her head. Her ankle looked better, less swollen, the bruising fading to a dull purple. But he'd caught her wincing last night, masking it with a smile when Lucas asked for another story. She was tough, he'd give her that. Tougher than she looked. Emma and Lucas burst in from the porch, their cheeks pink from the morning chill. Can Claire come with us today? Emma asked, tugging at Dan's sleeve. To the creek, she said. She likes water. She's not hiking anywhere, Dan said, pouring coffee into his mug. Ankle's still healing. I can hear you, you know, Claire's voice called from the couch, groggy but amused. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, her hair a wild halo in the morning light. I'm not an invalid. I could use some fresh air. Dan raised an eyebrow, leaning against the counter. Fresh air's one thing, trudging through mud's another. Then take me somewhere easy, she countered, swinging her legs off the couch with a wince she couldn't hide. You're the expert. Show me something beautiful. The kids cheered, and Dan sighed, outvoted, All right, but you're not walking far, and I'm not carrying you again unless I have to. Deal, she said, her grin catching him off. God. It was the first time he'd seen her smile like that, open, unguarded, and it stirred something warm in his chest, something he quickly shoved down. An hour later, they were at a clearing near the cabin, a spot Dan hadn't visited in months. It wasn't far, just a quarter-mile down a gentle path, but it was one of Sarah's favorites, a wide meadow where the redwoods parted to let the sun spill through, dappling the grass with gold. The kids ran ahead, chasing butterflies, while Dan helped Claire settle on a fallen log, her crutch propped beside her. This is perfect, she said, tipping her head back to watch the light play through the leaves. Like the forest is breathing. Yeah, Dan agreed, his voice quieter than he meant. He unslung the Nikon from his neck, the weight familiar now after yesterday's shots at Hyperion. Sarah used to say that, said it felt alive here. Claire glanced at him, her expression softening. She had good taste. He nodded, focusing the lens on a cluster of ferns, the shutter clicking softly. The act felt less foreign now, the old rhythm creeping back. Claire watched him work, her silence comfortable, not pressing. After a few shots, he lowered the camera and met her gaze. You're getting the hang of it again, she said. That one's going to be something special. Maybe, he said, shrugging. You keep pushing me to try. Someone has to, she replied, her tone light but pointed. You're too good to let it go. He didn't argue this time, just handed her the camera to see for herself. She scrolled through the frames, her brow furrowing in concentration, then smiled. See, told you, this light, it's magic. Luck, he said again, but he couldn't hide the flicker of pride. They sat there a while, the kids' laughter drifting back, the meadow wrapping them in its stillness. Dan felt the tension. In his shoulders ease, a rare peace settling in. Then Lucas came barreling over, his small hands cupped around something. "Look what I found!" he shouted, opening his palms to reveal a silver locket, its chain tangled and muddy. It was by the creek. Claire's breath caught, her hand flying to her throat. "Where did you... Give it to me, please!" Her voice was sharp, urgent, and Lucas blinked, startled, but handed it over. Dan frowned as she clutched the locket, her fingers trembling. "Yours?" he asked. "Yes," she said, too fast. She pried it open, revealing a faded photo. A teenage girl with dark hair and an older man, both smiling under a redwood. Her eyes welled up and she snapped it shut, gripping it like a lifeline. "Claire!" Dan's voice was low, steady. "You okay?" She nodded, but it was unconvincing. "I lost it years ago. When I was here with my dad, I didn't think—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Sorry, it's just, he gave it to me before he got sick." Dan reached out, hesitant, then rested a hand on her shoulder. "Hey, it's all right. Things turn up when you least expect." She managed a shaky smile, clutching the locket to her chest. "Yeah, guess they do." The moment hung there, fragile and raw, until Emma called them over to see a frog she'd found. Dan helped Claire up, her arm warm under his grip, and they joined the kids, the mood lifting as Lucas tried to mimic the frog's croak. But the locket stayed in Claire's hand, a quiet weight Dan couldn't ignore. That afternoon, back at the cabin, Claire seemed lighter, like finding the locket had unlocked something in her. She helped Dan fix the porch swing, a rickety thing he'd been meaning to repair for months. Her hands were steady with a hammer, surprising him again with her competence. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, holding a plank steady as she drove a nail in. "Dad," she said, grinning. "He built half our house, said I'd thank him someday." "He was right," Dan said, and she laughed, the sound mingling with the breeze. They finished the swing together, testing it with a creak and a sway, the kids piling on until it groaned under their weight. Claire's laughter mixed with theirs, and Dan felt a pang. Sarah would have loved this. Later, as the sun dipped low, Claire pulled him aside. "Take me back to Hyperion tomorrow," she said. "Sunrise. I want you to shoot it again. For me." He raised an eyebrow. "Bossy, aren't you?" "Please," she added, her eyes twinkling. "You owe me for the swing." He chuckled, a rare sound even to his own ears. "Fine. Sunrise it is." That night, after the kids were in bed, Dan sat by the fire, Claire across from him with a mug of tea. The locket hung around her neck now, glinting in the firelight. She caught him looking and touched it absently. "Thanks," she said. "For today, for all of this." "Don't mention it," he replied, but her gratitude settled over him like a blanket. They talked a while about the forest, the kids, nothing heavy, until she yawned, stretching like a cat. "Get some sleep," he said. "Big day tomorrow." She nodded, settling back on the couch, but as he turned to his room, she called after him. "Dan? Yeah, you're a good man. Don't let anyone tell you different." He paused, her words hitting harder than they should have. "Night, Claire," he said, closing his door before she could see the flush creeping up his neck. Sleep came slow, her voice echoing in his mind. A good man. He hadn't felt like one in years, not since Sarah slipped away, leaving him to fumble through fatherhood alone. But Claire saw something in him, something he'd forgotten, and as the redwoods whispered outside, Dan wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was right. The air was sharp and cold when Dan woke, the kind of pre-dawn chill that seeped into your bones and made you question early promises. He rolled out of bed, rubbing sleep from his eyes, the cabin still cloaked in shadow. Claire's request echoed. In his mind, Hyperion at sunrise, and he couldn't deny the pull of it, the chance to see the giant through his lens again. He dressed quickly, layering a flannel over his thermal shirt, and stepped into the living room. Claire was already up, perched on the couch's edge, lacing her boots with careful movements. The fire had died to embers, casting a faint glow across her face. She looked up as he entered, her locket glinting at her throat, and offered a small smile. "Ready? You sure about this?" Dan asked, nodding at her ankle. "It's not. Too late to back out?" "Positive," she said, standing with a slight wince. "I've got my crutch, and you." He grunted, masking the warmth her words stirred. "All right. Let's move before the kids wake up and guilt me into dragging them along." They slipped out into the dark. The forest hushed except for the crunch of pine needles underfoot. Dan carried a thermos of coffee and the Nikon, its strap a familiar weight across his chest. Claire leaned on her crutch, her pace slow but determined, her breath puffing white in the frigid air. The trail to Hyperion was familiar to Dan, every route, every curve, but with Claire beside him it felt new, alive in a way it hadn't since Sarah. They reached the tree just as the sky began to lighten, a thin band of pink bleeding into the horizon. Hyperion loomed above them, its bark rough and ancient, a silent witness to countless dawns. Dan set the thermos on a rock and lifted the camera, adjusting the focus as the first rays pierced the canopy. "Perfect," Claire murmured, her voice barely audible. She stood beside him, her crutch planted in the earth, watching the light climb the trunk. "Just like I remember." Dan clicked the shutter, capturing the moment, the golden glow, the mist curling around the roots. He kept shooting, losing, himself in the rhythm, the world narrowing to the frame. Claire's presence anchored him, her quiet awe fueling his own. When he finally lowered the camera, the sun was up, bathing the forest in a soft, warm haze. "Show me," she said, stepping closer. He handed her the Nikon, their fingers brushing, and she scrolled through the shots, her face lighting up. "These are incredible, Dan, better than yesterday." "Lucky light," he said, but he couldn't hide the grin tugging at his lips. She handed the camera back, and for a moment they stood there, the tree towering over them, the silence thick with something unspoken. Then the sound came, a low, rhythmic thump growing louder, cutting through the stillness. Dan frowned, scanning the sky. What the hell? A helicopter crested the ridge, its blades slicing the air, black and sleek against the dawn. Claire froze, her hand tightening on the crutch, her face draining of color. "No," she whispered. "Not now." "Claire." Dan turned to her, alarm prickling his skin. "What's going on?" Before she could answer, the chopper touched down in a clearing 50 yards away, kicking up dust and pine needles. 3 figures emerged. 2 men in suits, crisp and out of place, and a woman in a tailored coat, her heels sinking into the dirt as she strode toward them. Claire's shoulders slumped, but she squared them again, like she was steeling herself. "For a fight, Miss Whitmore," the woman called, her voice clipped and professional. "We've been looking everywhere for you." Dan's head snapped to Claire. "Whitmore?" She didn't meet his eyes, just clutched the locket tighter. "I can explain," she said, her voice low, urgent. "Just give me a minute." The woman reached them, her gaze flicking to Dan with cool appraisal. "I'm Vanessa Pierce, Miss Whitmore's assistant. We apologize for the intrusion, but this couldn't wait." "Intrusion!" Dan crossed his arms, stepping between Claire and the newcomers. "Who are you people? What's this about?" Claire touched his arm, her hand trembling but firm. "Dan, it's okay. They're with me." "With you?" He stared at her, the pieces clicking too fast, too wrong. "What the hell's going on, Claire?" She exhaled, her breath shaky, and faced him fully. "My name's Claire Whitmore. I run the Whitmore Conservation Fund. It's a non-profit, well, a big one. I didn't tell you because I needed to get away. From all of it." Dan blinked, the words sinking in like stones. "Conservation Fund? You mean you're some kind of billionaire?" Vanessa supplied, her tone dry. "One of the most influential environmentalists in the country, and she's been missing for 4 days. 3, Claire corrected sharply. "And I wasn't missing. I was here." Dan took a step back, his mind reeling. Billionaire. The word didn't fit. Not the woman who'd laughed with his kids, who'd hammered nails into his porch swing. "You lied to me," he said, his voice rougher than he meant. "I didn't lie," she said, desperation creeping in. "I just didn't tell you everything. I needed to be normal for once. No expectations, no pressure. You gave." "Be that, Dan?" He shook his head, anger and hurt tangling in his gut. "And those fancy folks Tom mentioned? That was them." "Yes," she admitted. "I told my team I was taking a break. They don't handle it well when I go off grid." Vanessa stepped forward, her patience thinning. "Ms. Whitmore, the board's in a panic. And your doctor. Your appointment was yesterday. We need you back in San Francisco." "Doctor?" Dan's eyes narrowed. "What's she talking about?" Claire hesitated, then looked away, her jaw tight. "It's nothing. It's not nothing. Vanessa. Got in. She's got pulmonary fibrosis, diagnosed 6 months ago. 3 years, maybe less, if she doesn't take care of herself." The air punched out of Dan's lungs. 3 years! He stared at Claire, her silence confirming it, and the world tilted. "You're sick, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" "I didn't want pity," she said, her voice breaking. "I came here to live, Dan, not to be a patient." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a step. "Jesus, Claire, you dropped this on me, billionaire dying, and expect me to just nod and smile?" "I'm not dying today," she snapped, then softened. "I'm sorry, I should have told you. But I couldn't. Not when you and the kids. You made me feel alive again." Vanessa cleared her throat. "We have a jet waiting. Ms. Whitmore, please." Claire shook her head. "I'm not going, not yet." "Claire," Dan started, but she cut him off. "Don't tell the kids," she said, her eyes pleading. "Please, they don't need to." "And no," he stared at her, torn between fury and something deeper, something that ached. "You don't get to call the shots here," he said. "Not after this." "I know," she whispered, "but I'm asking." The suits hovered, impatient, but Dan ignored them, his gaze locked on Claire. She looked small against Hyperion's bulk, fragile in a way he hadn't seen before. He wanted to shake her, to demand answers, but the memory of Sarah, her own fight, her own secrets, stopped him cold. "Fine," he said finally, "for now, but we're talking about this. All of it." She nodded, relief flooding her face. "Thank you." Vanessa sighed, gesturing to the chopper. "We'll be in touch. Ms. Whitmore, don't make this harder than it needs to be." As the helicopter lifted off, Dan and Claire stood in its wake, the wind whipping around them. He didn't know what to say. Anger still simmered, but so did something else. Something he couldn't name. She reached for his hand, tentative, and he didn't pull away. "I'm still me," she said, "just with more baggage than you thought." He snorted, a bitter edge to it. "That's one way to put it." They walked back in silence, the sunrise forgotten, Hyperion's shadow stretching long behind them. Dan's mind churned, billionaire, sick here, and he wondered how much more she was hiding. But as her fingers brushed his, he knew one thing. Whatever came next, he wasn't letting her go that easy. The walk back from Hyperion felt longer than it should have, the forests quiet, pressing against Dan's ears like a held breath. Claire limped beside him, her crutch digging into the earth, her face set in a mask of determination he recognized. Too well, Sarah had worn it near the end, defiance against a body failing her. He didn't look at Claire, not yet. His mind was a tangle of her revelations, billionaire, sick, hiding, and he needed space to sort it, even if the trail offered none. Back at the cabin, the kids were still asleep, the morning still clinging to its edges. Dan pushed the door open, letting Claire in first, and she sank onto the couch with a sigh that sounded more like relief than exhaustion. He stood by the counter, arms crossed, staring at the coffee pot like it held answers. "You mad?" asked finally, her voice cutting through the silence. He snorted a rough sound. Mad's one word for it, confused's another. You drop a bomb like that, billionaire, 3 years left, and expect me to just shrug? I didn't expect anything, she said, her tone steady but soft. I just didn't know how to tell you, not without changing this. She gestured vaguely at the cabin, the warmth of it, the kids' drawings pinned to the fridge. Changing what? He pressed, turning to face her. You think I'd treat you different because you got money? Or because you're... He stopped, the word dying sticking in his throat. Sick, she finished for him, unflinching. And maybe, most people do. They see the bank account or the diagnosis and stop seeing me. Dan shook his head, running a hand through his hair. I'm not most people, Claire, but you should have trusted me, after everything. I do trust you, she said, leaning forward, her hands clasped tight. That's why I stayed. Why? I'm telling you now. He wanted to believe her, God he did, but the sting of her omission lingered. What else you holding back? He asked. Because I'm not doing this half-blind. She exhaled, her fingers brushing the locket at her throat. Nothing else. That's the big stuff, money, health. I came here because I'm tired, Dan. Tired of boardrooms and hospitals and people looking at me like I'm a ticking clock. I wanted something real, and I found it. Her words hit him square in the chest, loosening something he'd kept locked, tight since Sarah. He sank into the armchair across from her, elbows on his knees, and studied her, really studied her. The lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair, the way she held herself like she was braced for a fall. She wasn't lying now. He could feel it. Real's messy, he said finally. Kids, bills, me yelling at you for lying. You sure that's what you want? She smiled, a small, crooked thing. Messy's better than sterile, and I'm not scared of you yelling. He huffed a laugh, the tension easing a fraction. Good, 'cause I'm not done. They sat there a while, the fire's embers glowing. Faintly, the cabin waking up around them. Emma and Lucas stumbled in soon after, bleary-eyed but chattering, and Claire slipped into their orbit like nothing had changed, helping Lucas tie his shoes, praising Emma's latest drawing. Dan watched, his anger fading into something softer, harder to name. Later, after the kids were off to school, Claire hobbled outside, eyeing the trail bridge near the cabin, a rickety thing half-collapsed from last month's rain. That's a hazard, she said, pointing. Someone's going to break their neck. Been meaning to fix it, Dan admitted, scratching his jaw. No time. Let's do it now, she said, already limping toward the shed. You've got tools, right? He stared at her. You're kidding. Your ankle is fine. Enough, she cut in, grinning. Come on, I need to earn my keep. Against his better judgment, he followed. They spent the morning hauling planks and nails, Claire directing him with a precision that surprised him, measuring angles, testing weight like she'd built bridges before. Her hands were steady, her focus sharp, and Dan found himself falling. Into step, their rhythms sinking without effort. By noon the bridge stood solid, a small triumph under the redwood's watchful gaze. You're full of surprises, he said, wiping sweat from his brow as they tested it with a cautious step. Dad was a stickler for details, she replied, leaning on the railing. Taught me more than I realized. They sat on the bridge, after sharing the last of the thermos coffee, the creek gurgling below. Claire's locket caught the light, and Dan nodded at it. He'd be proud. Of this, I mean. Maybe, she said, her voice softening. He always said the best legacy was something you could touch, not just money or words. Dan thought of Sarah, the quilts still on the kids' beds, the garden she'd planted out back, overgrown now but hers. Yeah, I get that. She turned to him, her hazel eyes searching. I don't want pity, Dan, or a savior. I just want this for as long as I've got. He held her gaze, the weight of her words settling deep. I'm no savior, he said, barely keeping my own head above water, but I don't pity you. Never did. Good, she said, and the relief in her voice was palpable. They finished. The coffee in silence, the forest humming around them, and Dan felt a shift, like roots taking hold, tentative but strong. That afternoon, while the kids napped, Claire pulled out his old notebook from the shelf, a battered thing filled with photo notes and sketches from his younger days. She flipped to a blank page and started drawing, her pencil scratching softly. Dan peered over her shoulder, curious despite himself. "What's that?" he asked. "A dream," she said, not looking up. "A nature center, here, in Redwood, for kids like Emma and Lucas. Art, science, trails, something lasting." He studied the sketch, simple but detailed. A low building nestled among the trees, windows wide to let the forest in. "Big dream," he said. "Big forest," she shot back, grinning. "Think it's crazy?" "Maybe," he admitted, "but crazy's not bad." She laughed, and he felt it again, that warmth spreading slow and sure. The day slipped into evening, the kids waking to demand a story, and Claire obliged, spinning a tale about a redwood prince and a creek princess. Dan listened from the kitchen, washing dishes, her voice weaving through the cabin like a thread pulling them all closer. Later, as the fire burned low, Claire turned to him, her expression serious. "I'm scared, Dan, not of dying, well, not just that, of leaving nothing behind that matters." He set his mug down, leaning forward. "You've got time, and you're not alone in this, not if you don't want to be." Her eyes welled up, but she blinked it back, nodding. "I don't want to be, I mean." "Then don't," he said, simple as that. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was close, and she seemed to feel it too. They sat there, the fire crackling, the kids' soft snores drifting from the hall, and Dan realized he wasn't just angry anymore. He was in, messy or not, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. Outside, the redwoods stood silent, their roots deep and unyielding, a promise of their own, one Dan was starting to believe in again. The days slipped into a rhythm Dan hadn't known he'd missed, a quiet dance of mornings with coffee and evenings by the fire. Claire's presence threading through it all like a melody he couldn't shake. A week had passed since the helicopter, since her secret spilled out under Hyperion's shadow, and though the air still carried the weight of her revelations, it felt lighter now, tempered by something growing between them. Trust, maybe, or more. That morning Dan woke to the sound of rain tapping the cabin roof, a soft patter that promised a slow day. He found Claire at the table sketching again, her nature center taking shape in sharp pencil lines, a dream she hadn't let go of. Emma and Lucas sprawled on the floor nearby, coloring books open, their chatter a steady hum. Claire glanced up as he entered, her locket swaying as she moved, and offered a smile that felt like sunlight through the clouds. "Rain's keeping the tours off," he said, pouring coffee. "Guess we're stuck inside." "Good," she replied, tapping her pencil against the paper. "Gives us time to plan." "Plan what?" he asked, leaning over to see her sketch, a circular building now with a greenhouse attached, trails winding into the forest. "This," she said, her eyes bright. "I've been thinking Redwood needs something like this, for the kids, for the community. You could run the photography part, teach them what you know." He raised an eyebrow, sipping his coffee to buy time. "Me? I'm no teacher." "You're better than you think," she countered. "I've seen you with Emma and Lucas. Patient, steady. They'd learn more from you than some fancy professor." He grunted, flattered despite himself. "Big ideas, Claire. Takes more than sketches to make 'em real." "I know," she said undeterred, "but it's a start, and I've got resources." The word hung there, a reminder of her other life, the billionaire part she'd downplayed but couldn't erase. Dan set his mug down, crossing his arms. "You mean money?" "Some," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "But it's not just that. It's time, too. I want to use what I've got, while I've got it." Her illness lingered in the subtext, unspoken but heavy. Dan nodded, slow, letting it sink in. "All right." Keep dreaming. Just don't expect me to jump in front of a classroom yet." She grinned, a spark of victory in her eyes. Deal! The rain kept them indoors, but Claire's energy pulled them out of routine. She roped the kids into a game of charades, her laughter filling the cabin as Lucas flailed, mimicking a bear. Dan watched from the armchair, a warmth spreading through him he hadn't felt since Sarah, different but real. When Claire collapsed onto the couch, breathless, she caught his eye and winked, like they were sharing a secret. Later, after lunch, grilled cheese and tomato soup, a cozy standby. Claire turned to him. "Take me somewhere special," she said. "Your pick." Rain slowing. He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, kids, grab your boots." They piled into his old pickup, the kids in the back under a tarp, Claire beside him up front. The drive was short, just a mile down a rutted road, to a grove Sarah had loved, a hidden pocket of redwoods where the rain dripped slow and the air smelled of earth and memory. Dan parked, helping Claire out, her crutch sinking into the moss. As they walked, "This is it," he said, stopping at the grove's edge. The trees here were older, gnarled, their branches weaving a canopy that softened the drizzle. Sarah called it her cathedral. Claire took it in, her breath catching. "It's perfect." The kids ran ahead, splashing in puddles, while Dan and Claire lingered under a massive redwood, its trunk wide enough to hide them both. She leaned against it, her crutch propped nearby, and looked at him. Really looked, her hazel eyes searching. "You miss her?" she said. "Not a question." "Every day," he admitted, his voice rough. "Doesn't mean I'm stuck, though." "Not anymore." She nodded, understanding more than he'd said. "I miss my dad the same way, but being here, it's like he's closer." Dan reached for her hand, tentative, and she laced her fingers through his, warm despite the chill. "Guess we've got that in common," he said. "More than that," she replied, squeezing his hand. The rain faded to a mist, and Dan felt a pull, something reckless, something alive. He dug into his pocket, pulling out an old radio he kept in the truck, its batteries still good. He fiddled with the dial until a staticky tune came through, a slow country song, the kind Sarah used to hum. "Dance with me," he said, surprising himself. Claire's eyes widened, then softened. "Here?" "Here," he confirmed, setting the radio on a route. He held out his hand and she took it, stepping into his arms, her crutch forgotten. They moved slow, awkward at first, her ankle unsteady, his boots slipping on the moss, but it didn't matter. The music wrapped around them, her head resting against his chest, his arms steady around her waist. The kids giggled from the puddles, but Dan didn't care. For the first time in years he felt whole. When the song ended, they didn't pull apart, just stood there, breathing together. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. "For what?" he asked, his chin brushing her hair. "For this," she said. "For seeing me." He tipped her face up, meeting her gaze, and the world shrank to just them. The grove, the rain, the promise of something more. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but the want was there, simmering, and she felt it too, her smile trembling. Back at the cabin, Claire surprised him again. She pulled a small box from her backpack, a new camera lens, sleek and expensive, wrapped in tissue. "For you," she said, handing it over, "to capture what matters." "Claire," he started, stunned. "This is too much." "It's not," she insisted. "You've given me more than money can buy. Let me give you this." He took it, the weight of it solid in his hands, and nodded. "All right, but you're posing for me next time." "Deal." She laughed, and the sound carried him through the evening. After dinner, he set up the Nikon with the new lens, snapping a shot of her with the kids, Emma braiding Claire's hair, Lucas sprawled across her lap. The photo was perfect, raw, alive, and Dan felt a pang of gratitude so sharp it hurt. That night, as the kids slept, Claire sat by the fire, her sketchbook open. Dan joined her, the silence easy now. "You're good for us," he said, the words slipping out unplanned. "You're good for me," she replied, her voice soft. Better than you know. He reached for her hand again, and she held on, her thumb tracing his knuckles. Outside the rain stopped, the redwoods standing sentinel, and Dan knew he was falling, slow, sure, and unafraid. The sky turned restless overnight, clouds rolling in thick and grey, a promise of something fiercer than the gentle rain of yesterday. Dan woke to the distant rumble of thunder, the cabin creaking under the first gusts of wind. He lay still, a moment listening, the memory of Claire in his arms, their dance in the grove, lingering like a warm ache. It was real now, this thing between them, and it scared him as much as it steadied him. He found her in the kitchen, pouring coffee, her movements slower than usual. She'd pulled her hair back, the locket resting against her sweater, but there was a tightness around her eyes he hadn't noticed before. "Storm's coming," she said, handing him a mug. "Big one by the sound of it." "Yeah," Dan agreed, sipping the coffee. "Park'll be a mess. Might need to check the trails after." Emma and Lucas burst in, still in pajamas, their excitement palpable. "Can we watch the lightning?" Lucas asked, climbing onto a chair. "From the porch?" "If it's safe," Dan said, ruffling his hair. "School's off today. Bus won't run in this." Claire smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She turned to the sink, rinsing a plate, and Dan caught the slight tremble in her hands. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Fine," she said, too quick. "Just tired. Didn't sleep much." He didn't push, not yet, but the unease settled in his gut like a stone. The morning unfolded in fits and starts, the kids drawing storm pictures, Claire sketching her nature center, Dan pacing between the window and the radio, tracking the weather. By noon, the wind howled, rattling the shutters, and rain lashed the roof in sheets. A call came from Tom at the park office. Hikers stranded near the North Ridge, caught off guard by the storm's speed. "Gotta go," Dan said, grabbing his rain gear. "They're close to the old lookout. Won't take long." Claire looked up, her pencil stilling. "I'll come, I can help." "No chance," he shot back, zipping his jacket. "Your ankle's not up for it, and I'm not hauling you through. I'm not useless," she said, standing, her jaw set. "I've handled worse than a little rain." "It's not a little rain," he snapped, sharper than he meant. "It's a damn storm, and you're staying put." She glared at him, but the fight drained out of her as a gust shook the cabin. "Fine," she muttered. "Be careful." "Always am," he said, softer now. He hesitated, then squeezed her shoulder, the closest he could get to reassurance with the kids watching. "Keep them busy," she nodded, and he stepped into the chaos outside, the wind snatching at his hood. The drive to the ridge was treacherous. Mud, slick under the tires, branches snapping across the road. But he found the hikers quickly, a young couple, soaked and shivering, their tent shredded by the storm. Dan got them to the truck, radioing Tom for pickup, his mind half on Claire, her stubborn streak, her trembling hands. Back at the cabin, the power flickered as he stomped inside, dripping water across the floor. The kids rushed him, babbling about a thunderclap that shook the windows, but Claire wasn't at the table. He found her in the living room, mid-stride with an armful of blankets. Just as she stumbled, a harsh cough ripping through her. The blankets fell, and she braced herself against the couch, gasping, "Claire!" Dan crossed the room in 2 steps, catching her as her knees buckled. She was light, too light, her breath ragged against his chest. "Jesus! What's happening?" "It's nothing," she wheezed. But the cough came again, deep and wet, and Dan's heart seized. He eased her onto the couch, the kids hovering, wide-eyed. "Emma, get a glass of water," he barked. "Lucas, blankets, now!" They scattered, and he turned back to Claire, his hands on her shoulders. "Talk to me. Is this—" "The fibrosis," she admitted, her voice thin. "It's worse in bad weather. I'm fine, Dan. Really, you're not fine," he cut in, panic sharpening his words. You're coughing like you're drowning. She managed a weak smile. Not drowning, just winded, it'll pass. He didn't believe her, not with her face pale, her lips tinged blue, but he held her steady, rubbing her back until the coughing eased. Emma returned with water, Lucas dragging a quilt, and Dan wrapped it around Claire, his mind racing. 3 years, Vanessa had said, maybe less. He'd known, but seeing it, feeling it was different. You should have told me it was this bad, he said, low enough the kids wouldn't hear. I didn't want to scare you, she replied, sipping the water, or them. Too late, he said, but there was no heat in it, just fear, raw and unfiltered. He sat beside her, the storm raging outside, and the kids climbed up, pressing close. Claire leaned into him, her breathing steadying, and for a while they just sat, the four of them, a small island in the chaos. Hours later, the rain slowed, but the tension didn't. Dan was stoking the fire when the hikers from earlier knocked. A man and woman, dry now, their faces familiar in a way he couldn't place. We wanted to thank you, the man said, extending a hand. Name's Greg Larson. This is my wife, Jill. Dan shook it, nodding. Glad you're okay. Jill smiled, hesitant. We're journalists, freelance. Heard about Claire Whitmore. Going missing. Saw her here earlier. That her? Dan stiffened, his grip tightening on the poker. You're mistaken. Greg raised a brow. Look, we're not here to stir trouble, but if it is her, we've got a proposition. Her fund's big news. We could write a piece, get her nature center funded. No pressure, just an offer. Dan glanced at Claire, now resting on the couch, her eyes closed. She's not interested, he said flatly. Thanks for the blankets. Safe travels. They left, reluctant, and Dan shut the door, his pulse thudding. Journalists. Another crack in Claire's carefully built escape. He turned to her, ready to warn her, but she was awake, watching him. They know, she said, her voice steady despite the fatigue. Yeah, he confirmed. Offered to fund your center. I sent 'em packing. She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Good, I don't want their help. Not like that. He crossed to her, sitting close. You're a magnet for trouble, you know that? Part of my charm, she quipped, but a cough cut her off, quieter this time. She leaned into him, and he wrapped an arm around her, the fire crackling soft. I'm scared too, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Of losing you. Her hand found his, squeezing tight. I'm still here, and I love you. Dan, that's what keeps me fighting. He froze, her words a jolt, simple, honest, shattering. Claire, don't say it back, she interrupted, her eyes glistening. Not unless you mean it. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek, and kissed her, slow, fierce, a promise he couldn't voice yet. She kissed him back, her breath hitching, and the storm outside faded, leaving only them. The moment broke when Lucas called from the hall, sleepy and confused, and Dan pulled away, both of them smiling through the weight. But as he tucked the kids in, Claire's cough echoed again, faint but persistent, and Dan knew the storm wasn't over, not the one outside or the one within her. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the forest dripping and hushed, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Dan stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the redwoods gleam under a tentative sun. The cabin was quiet. Emma and Lucas still asleep, worn out from yesterday's chaos, and Claire resting on the couch, her breathing steady now but fragile in a way that gnawed at him. Last night's kiss lingered on his lips, her words, I love you, echoing in his chest like a heartbeat he couldn't ignore. He'd barely slept, his mind wrestling with her illness, her confession, the journalist's offer. She'd brushed it off, didn't want their help, she'd said, but Dan couldn't shake the image of her collapsing, the cough that rattled her frame. 3 years, maybe less. The math didn't add up to the life he was starting to imagine with her, and it scared him more than he'd let on. Claire stirred inside, the couch creaking as she sat up. Dan stepped back in, setting his mug down, and found her rubbing her eyes, the quilt pooled around her waist. "Morning," she said, her voice rough but warm. "You look like you've been up all night." "Close enough," he admitted, sitting across from her. "How you feeling?" "Better," she said, stretching with a wince. "Yesterday was a lot. Sorry I scared you." "Don't apologize," he said, sharper than he meant. "Just don't hide it next time. I need to know." She nodded, her locket catching the light as she shifted. "Fair. No more hiding." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and studied her. "Those journalists, they could fund your center. Why turn it down?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Because it's not theirs to give. I've got the money, Dan, more than I'll ever need. If I'm building this, I want it to be mine, ours, not some headline they can slap their names on." "Ours," he repeated, caught off guard. She smiled, small but sure. "If you'll have it. I meant what I said last night. I love you. And I want this, us, the kids, the center, to be what I leave behind." Her words hit him like a wave, pulling him under. He stood, pacing to the window, the forest blurring as he processed it. Love. She'd said it again, and he felt it too. Felt it building since the grove, maybe before. But saying it back meant stepping into a future he wasn't sure he could hold on to. "Dan." Her voice was soft, uncertain now. "You don't have to." "I do," he cut in, turning to face her. "I love you too, Claire. That's not the problem." "Then what is?" she asked, standing despite the wobble in her legs. Closing. The distance between them. He took her hands, steadying her. "You're sick, and I'm terrified of losing you, like I lost Sarah. I can't do that again. Not to the kids, not to me." Her eyes welled up, but she didn't look away. "I can't promise you forever. No one can. But I can promise you now. Every day I've got left. Isn't that enough?" He swallowed hard, her hands warm in his, and saw Sarah in his mind. Her smile fading, her hand slipping from his. Then Claire, here, alive, fighting. "It's enough," he said finally, his voice breaking. "It has to be." She pulled him into a hug, her arms tight around him, and he held her back, burying his face in her hair. The kids' laughter broke, the moment spilling from the hall as they tumbled in, oblivious to the weight of it all. "Can we make pancakes?" Emma asked, tugging at Dan's sleeve. "Yeah," he said, clearing his throat. "Pancakes sound good." They cooked together, Claire flipping batter with a grin, Lucas sneaking chocolate chips, Emma bossing them all. And Dan felt the shift, the family they were becoming. Later they sat on the porch swing, the kids chasing each other across the damp grass, and Claire pulled out her sketchbook. "Let's make it real," she said, handing him a pencil. "You and me." He took it, sketching a trail beside her greenhouse, their hands brushing as they worked. The center took shape, a place for art, for kids, for Redwood, and Dan saw it, a legacy, not just hers, but theirs. That afternoon, they drove to town, Claire's idea, a pitch to the community. She stood in the small library, her crutch propped nearby, and talked to a handful of locals, rangers, teachers, parents. Dan watched, amazed, as she laid out her vision. Simple, heartfelt, no billionaire polish, just a woman who loved this place. He chimed in, gruff but steady, promising photo classes, trail upkeep. By the end, hands went up. Volunteers, donors, a chorus of yeses. Back at the cabin, Claire glowed, her energy back despite the long day. "We did it," she said, collapsing onto the couch. "It's happening." "You did it," he corrected, sitting beside her. "I just followed," she laughed, leaning into him. "Team effort." The kids were in bed when Dan pulled her close, the fire low. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out unplanned but right. Her breath caught, her eyes wide. "Dan." "Not tomorrow," he added quickly. "Whenever you're ready. But I want this, us, for real." She touched his face, her fingers trembling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He kissed her then, slow and deep, sealing it under the redwood's quiet watch. They married a week later, simple, just them, And the kids under Hyperion, Tom as witness, Emma scattering pine cones like flowers. Claire wore a sweater and jeans, her locket shining, and Dan felt whole, the past and present knitting together in her smile. Days blurred into weeks, the center's foundation laid, literally with dirt under their nails, and figuratively with every laugh, every plan. Claire's cough returned some mornings, quieter but there, and Dan held her through it, their love a shield against the inevitable. One evening, as spring edged into February's end, they stood at the site, beams up, walls rising. Claire leaned on him, her breath a little short. "It's beautiful," she said. "You're beautiful," he replied, kissing her forehead. And it was enough, for now, for them, for the roots they'd planted together. 2 years had slipped by since that storm-racked night, and the forest bore the marks of time's gentle hand. It was February 2027 now, the air crisp with the promise of spring, and Dan stood at the edge of the Whitmore Carter Nature Center, his boots planted in the soft earth. The building rose modest but proud among the redwoods, a low, circular structure of wood and glass, its greenhouse glinting in the late afternoon sun. Trails wound from its doors into the forest, alive with the chatter of kids and the rustle of leaves. It was everything Claire had dreamed, and more, because it was theirs. He adjusted the Nikon around his neck, its new lens a quiet companion these days, and scanned the scene. Emma, now 10, darted between picnic tables, her blonde curls bouncing, as she handed out flyers for the center's grand opening. Lucas, 8, trailed her, a clipboard clutched tight, checking names with the seriousness of a ranger. Dan smiled, a real, unguarded smile that still felt new sometimes. The kids had grown into this place, their laughter its heartbeat, and he saw Claire in every step they took. She wasn't here, not physically. 8 months ago her lungs had given out, the fibrosis claiming her in a quiet hospital room in Eureka, Dan's hand in hers, the kids curled beside her. It had been peaceful in the end, her smile faint but there, her last words a whispered "I love you" that carried him through the grief. He'd buried her under Hyperion, a simple stone marking her spot, her locket nestled in his pocket, until today. But she wasn't gone, not really. She lived in this center, in the kids, in him. The opening ceremony was small, just the way she'd wanted. Locals, rangers, a few donors who'd pitched in without fanfare. Tom, graying now, clapped Dan on the shoulder as he passed. "She'd be proud, man. Hell of a thing you've built." "We built," Dan corrected, his voice steady. "Couldn't have done it without her." Tom nodded, squeezing his arm, and moved off to wrangle a group of kids near the trailhead. Dan turned back to the center, its doors wide open, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor. Inside, the walls held her sketches, framed now alongside his photos. Hyperion at sunrise, the grove in rain, Claire laughing with Emma and Lucas. A gallery of their life, stitched together with love. Emma bounded up, her cheeks flushed. "Daddy, it's time. Everyone's waiting." All right, he said, ruffling her hair. "Lead the way, boss." She dragged him to the small stage, a platform by the greenhouse, draped with pine boughs, and Lucas handed him a microphone, grinning. Dan took it, stepping up, the crowd settling into a semicircle. Familiar faces, new ones, all here for this. He cleared his throat, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Folks," he began, his voice rough but clear, "thanks for coming. This place, the Whitmore Carter Nature Center. It's a dream my wife, Claire, had. She saw it first, sketched it out on a napkin one rainy day, and somehow convinced me it could be real." A chuckle rippled through the crowd, and he smiled. She was good at that, seeing what could be, not just what was. He paused, glancing at the kids, their eyes bright with pride. Claire loved Redwood, loved its roots, its giants, its quiet. She wanted a place where kids could feel that too, learn it, touch it, keep it alive. She didn't have long to make it happen, but she did. With us. So today's not just an opening. It's a promise To her, to you, to this forest. Applause broke out, warm and steady, and Dan stepped back, letting Emma take the mic. She stood tall, her voice ringing out. My mom, Claire, she wrote something for this. Daddy found it in her sketchbook. Can I read it? Go ahead, kiddo, Dan said, his throat tight. Emma unfolded a paper, her hands steady. To the family who showed me miracles grow where kindness takes root. Dan, Emma, Lucas, thank you. This center's for you, for every kid who'll run these trails, for every leaf that falls and grows again. Keep it alive. The crowd hushed, then clapped louder, a few wiping tears. Lucas tugged Dan's sleeve, whispering, Can we plant it now? Yeah, Dan said, nodding. Let's do it. They led the group to a clearing near the center, a spot Claire had picked. Open, sunny, perfect for a sapling. Dan knelt, digging into the soft soil with a shovel, Emma and Lucas beside him, their small hands patting the dirt around a young redwood, its needles vibrant green. For you, Claire, Dan murmured, too low for anyone else to hear, and the kids echoed, their voices a soft chorus. As the crowd dispersed, some to the trails, some to the greenhouse, Dan lingered, the sapling's shadow stretching across his boots. He pulled Claire's locket from his pocket, hanging it on a low branch where it caught the light, swaying gentle in the breeze. A woman approached, Jill, the journalist from that stormy day, her husband Greg behind her. Beautiful ceremony, she said, smiling. We wrote about it anyway. Small piece, local paper, no strings, just wanted people to know. Dan nodded, grateful. Thanks, she'd like that. They left, and Dan turned back to the center, the kids now inside, guiding a group through his photo room, a space he'd built with Claire's sketches in mind, cameras and easels lining the walls. He taught there twice a week now, kids from town and beyond, their eyes wide as he showed them light and shadow, the way Claire had shown him. Evening fell soft, the sky bruising purple, and Dan sat on the porch swing, fixed solid now, thanks. To her. A letter had come that morning, slipped under the cabin door while he'd been at the center. He pulled it from his jacket, the handwriting Claire's, the postmark old, something she'd mailed before she passed, delayed by some quirk of fate. Dan. It read, If you're reading this, we did it. The center's up, the kids are laughing. And you're still standing. I knew you would. There's a cabin, little place near the grove, deeds in my desk. It's yours now, ours forever. Keep capturing what matters. I love you, always will. He folded it, tears blurring the ink, and looked out at the redwoods, their branches swaying like they were nodding back. The cabin, she'd planned it, her final gift, a home for their memories. He'd move there soon. He'd decided with the kids, keep it alive like she'd said. Emma and Lucas ran out, piling onto the swing, their warmth grounding him. Can we stay here tonight? Lucas asked, his eyes on the center's lights. Yeah, Dan said, pulling them close. We'll stay. They sat there, the three of them, the forest whispering around them, and Dan felt it. Peace, full and deep, a legacy not just in stone or saplings, but in the love they'd built. Claire was gone, but she'd left them whole, her miracles rooted in every leaf, every laugh. And as the stars broke through the dusk, Dan lifted the Nikon, snapping one last shot, the kids, the center, the redwoods, a frame of forever for her. And that's the end of Redwood Redemption. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're watching from the redwood forests of California, a cozy cabin somewhere else, or maybe a bustling city far away. Your stories mean the world to me. If this journey touched your heart, or if you're excited for more tales of love, kindness, and hope, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so we can keep exploring together. Every new friend here keeps this channel growing. Thank you so much for watching, for sharing this time with Dan, Claire, and me. You're the reason these stories come to life. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you soon.